As a government, we've been very, very clear that we will stand up for Canadian interests, and we will stand up loudly and clearly for human rights all around the world.
And when I made the videos about Bill C-16, I thought it through, and I thought, there's no damn way I'm following this law. I don't care what happens. And I didn't say that lightly, I thought it through. I thought, okay, well, let's assume the worst case scenario, and the worst case scenario would be that a student would report me to the Ontario Human Rights Commission, and then they would do an investigation. Then they would find me guilty because the Ontario Human Rights Commission finds 99% of the people brought to it guilty, because that's what totalitarians do. And then I would refuse to pay the fine or cooperate with whatever the re-education they would put me through would be. And then that would move to civil court, and then I would be fined for contempt, and then it would, then the whole legal catastrophe would unfold. And I thought, well, I could either do that, or I could allow the government to regulate my speech. It's like, nope, that's not happening. So you might think about that as confrontational, and it is confrontational. It's like, there isn't a goddamn thing that can be done to me to make me allow the government to compel my speech. That's not happening. And the reason for that, I believe the reason for that, is because I spent decades studying totalitarianism. It's not good. And the way that totalitarian states develop is that people give up their right to be, their right to exist with their own thoughts. They lie. That's what happens, is that individuals sacrifice their own souls to the dictates of the state. And then everything goes badly sideways. It's like, and you think, well, how much evidence for that do we need? You're looking at 250 million deaths. It's like, isn't that enough? Well, the people that I read who were profound, Viktor Frankl's a good example for beginners. If you want to read about this sort of thing, he wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning. And Frankl, and also Solzhenitsyn, and a variety of other commentators as well, who really looked into what happened in both in Nazi Germany and in the communist states. Their conclusion was universal, is that the lies of the state, the lies and tyranny of the state, are aided and abetted by the moral sacrifice of the individual. It's not top down. The Nazis are telling you what to do and you're all innocent and obeying. That's not how it works. Is you falsify your being bit by bit, and you end up where you don't want to be. And that's a bad idea. And if you're interested in that, there's a great book called Ordinary Men. You read that and you won't be the same person afterwards, so I would beware of reading it. But it's a story about these policemen in Germany. So they were middle-aged guys, and they grew up and were socialized before the Nazis came to power. So they were just your typical middle-class policemen. And they were brought into Poland after the Nazis had marched through, and charged with keeping order in the occupied state. And they knew, their commander knew that it was going to be brutal, because they were in wartime, and they regard the Jews, for example, as enemies, and so there was going to be a fair bit of rounding up with all of that, with all of what that implied. And the commander told the policemen that they could go home if they wanted to, that they didn't have to participate in this. And then what Ordinary Men does is document their transformation from ordinary policemen, the sort of people that you know, to guys who were taking naked pregnant women out into the middle of fields and shooting them in the back of the head. And it documents one step at a time how an ordinary person turns into someone like that. You think, well, we don't want that sort of thing to happen anymore. Well, then you don't want to be that sort of person. That's how it's fixed. And if you're not going to be that sort of person, then you don't take the first steps. Because the first steps lead you down a pathway that, at least in principle, you don't want to go. So, well, I think part of what makes me combative, say, compared to someone like Haidt, is that I've spent years looking at the worst things there are to look at. And I've learned from that, and I've certainly learned things that I won't do. And one of them is, I won't let the government regulate my speech. It's a mistake. I don't care what compassionate principles hypothetically motivate that move. It was unprecedented in English common law, that move. And it was all buried under this leftist compassion, which is mostly a lie. So I have reasons, I think, other than those that motivate someone like Jonathan Haidt to be particularly passionate about this issue.
I've heard a number of interesting things about Islam from you and one of your intellectual soulmates, Camille Paglia. Paglia says that men and women benefit in many ways from living in largely separate worlds, as they did in traditional European societies and obviously as they do in much of the Muslim world today. Relatedly, Paglia considers passionate masculinity a critical force for defending, sustaining, and advancing civilization. And she argues that passionate masculinity, while virtually moribund in the Western middle and upper classes, is alive and well in the Muslim world. You have expressed some sympathy for the Muslim critique of the West, its godlessness, its spiritual void, its materialism, its technology-induced removal from life's elemental realities. You've said it is extraordinarily naive to believe that the differences between European culture and Islamic culture are not about anything fundamental. You've expressed concern that Islam is a totalizing system, and in a quote that stood out to me, you said in a Patreon chat on YouTube that in your view, quote, the only countries in the world that are essentially worth living in any real sense, are the ones that are predicated on the Judeo-Christian tradition and manifested in the Western body of laws, unquote. So an open-ended question, how would you synthesize your perspective on Islam and the fact that the Muslim populations of Europe and Canada, a product of recent immigration, are growing and reproducing much faster than the European-descended populations in these countries?
Man, you guys really did spend a lot of time coming up with troublesome questions, didn't you?
We can end with
See,
that.
one of the problems is that I'm an ignorant man, and there's lots of things that I don't know. You know, and I don't understand Islam. I don't know enough about it to be an intelligent commentary on it. I've done my best to peck away at the edges, but you know, it would require multiple years of study to understand the similarities and differences between the two viewpoints. It looks to me like what Islam did was take a group of radically disparate tribes and unite them under a single ethos. Of course, the Muslim civilization expanded more rapidly than any other civilization ever had, and occupied a very large part of the world, which of course it still does. Perhaps there's something to be said for that unifying tendency. There's a problem, and maybe this is at the core of the problem. There's no distinction between church and state in Islam. And there is a distinction between church and state in the West. It isn't obvious to me, if it's the case that our culture is grounded in an underlying, let's call it literary metaphysic, something like that, a religious metaphysic. Part of the bedrock of our culture is the idea of the separation between church and state. And as far as I can tell, that idea doesn't exist in the Muslim world. And so I cannot understand how that faith is commensurate with the institutions of the West. It doesn't seem to me that there's any evidence that it's commensurate, because the number of Islamic democracies is, let's call it, finite. The best example has probably been Turkey. And Turkey, as far as I can tell, isn't doing that well at the moment on the democratic front. And it looked like the great shining hope. And a lot of that was a consequence of secularization.